The parish council of Flaxborough had gathered, as it did once a month, to congratulate itself on achieving very little with the utmost decorum. The evening's agenda promised the usual, a debate on the morally troubling rise in wheelie bins, left ajar, an inspection of the faded bunting left over from last year's Civic Week, and a brief but impassioned tirade from Councillor Broxby concerning the menace of teenagers who loitered without buying anything. Inspector Purbright sat as an invited observer, which in the eyes of the council meant a respected pillar of order, and in Purbright's own estimation meant a polite obligation slightly preferable to a dental appointment. He maintained an expression of gentle attentiveness, while his mind wandered to the quiet comfort of the police station's filing room. The droning of Councillor Broxby was abruptly interrupted by a sound so foreign to the chamber that several members rose bird-like from their seats. It drifted through the open sash window, a long, pure note, rising with the precision of a practiced soprano, not merely sweet, but startlingly familiar. Mrs. Barrowby Lodge, who considered herself something of an authority on the supernatural, since her cousin's cat had once stared meaningfully at a closed door, clutched the table. "Good heavens!" she whispered. "It's her! It's the Nightingale!" Several councillors crossed themselves, though uncertainly, in case it wasn't the done thing in municipal buildings. From the far end of the room, Mr. Pell, retired, organist of St. Dismas's, leaned forward with the solemnity of one listening to divine judgment. "Margaret Seviston," he breathed. "There can be no doubt." The window trembled again as the voice drifted through the air, filling the room with a clarity that felt unnervingly present, as though the singer stood in the very doorway, unseen. Yet Margaret Seviston, the famed Nightingale of Fallow Glen, had been dead since 1974. Councillor Broxby, who disliked disruptions unless he caused them, tried repeatedly to call the meeting to order. The ringing of his ceremonial bell was no match for the spectral soprano. "Inspector," cried Mrs. Barrowby Lodge, as though Purbright held special jurisdiction over disembodied voices. "Surely you heard that? Surely—" "I believe everyone heard it," Purbright replied, gently. Behind his mild expression, a small flicker of curiosity passed across his thoughts. The note had been too clean, too deliberate. A real human voice possesses small imperfections, those subtle fluctuations of breath and intention. This one carried the unmistakable signature of recording. But the councillors, thrilled at the idea of being witnesses to something newspaper-worthy, had already started arguing about whether ghosts should require permission to perform on public land. A third note swelled through the window, this time ending abruptly, as though cut off by a clumsy hand. Purbright's head tilted just slightly. That, too, was interesting. The chairman abandoned any attempt at governance and marched stiffly to the window. Beyond the hall, Fallow Glen lay in its usual darkness, a fold of trees, a sloping meadow, and the faint glimmer of water from the ornamental lake. The sound had come from there, unmistakably. "We must call someone," said Mrs. Barrowby Lodge. "A medium." "Or the bishop." "Or both." "Possibly," Purbright said, "though perhaps it would be wise to wait and see if this Nightingale has further engagements." His dry comment went unnoticed in the rising babble. It took nearly 20 minutes for the meeting to regain its original momentum, and even then the councillors performed their duties with the distracted air of people who had glimpsed the thin, exciting veil between the mundane and the melodramatic. But Purbright's attention remained fixed on the glen. He had visited it dozens of times over the years, a peaceful stretch of land where courting couples lingered and where fishermen nursed flasks of tea as though receiving medical treatment through a spout. There had been a time, long ago, when Margaret Severston practised her scales there, her voice rising above the rustle of leaves like a promise of greatness. Purbright remembered hearing her once by accident, a moment he had never entirely forgotten. But Margaret had died young, mourned briefly, and then folded neatly into the patchwork of local memory. Only the older residents spoke of her now, and then usually in the wistful tones reserved for discontinued chocolate bars. The council meeting stumbled to its natural, exhausted close. As the members gathered their papers with trembling hands, Mrs. Barrowby Lodge finally approached Purbright. "You're not going to pretend this is ordinary, are you?" she demanded. "A dead woman's voice floating over the glen," or brighter, gave one of his small, courteous smiles. "Ordinary? No, but explainable, I should think." "Explainable?" She stared at him as though he had suggested the earth were round. "Yes," he said mildly. "Most things are in time." He stepped outside into the cool night air. The moon cast a pale glaze over the tops of the trees, and for a moment the glen seemed to breathe. A long, quiet exhalation of something old stirred awake. From somewhere deep inside it came a faint rustling. Not birds, not wind. Something more deliberate. Purbright listened, hands in pockets, head inclined like a man noticing the faintest ripple across still water. He murmured. A curious opening note. And with that he walked toward the police station, the faintest echo of the impossible song trailing behind him like a question waiting for the right moment to be answered. Morning arrived in Flaxborough with the ordinary clatter of milk deliveries, the faint whine of a bus engine reluctantly beginning its route, and the more assertive rustling of townsfolk preparing to exchange news before breakfast plates had properly cooled. By 8:30, the incident at Fallow Glen had already spread through the town with a vividness and accuracy that diminished in direct proportion to the enthusiasm with which it was told. Purbright, passing quietly by the bakery on his way to the station, detected the unmistakable acceleration of gossip in full bloom. Mrs. Beadle, whose voice had the carrying power of a church bell on an east wind, was telling an audience of 3 that she had been close enough to see a shimmering shape hovering over the grass, a detail confidently expressed, despite her having been at home with her curtains drawn at the time. It was Margaret herself, she insisted, her plump hand resting theatrically on her chest. Her very soul singing out. You can't mistake a voice like that, Inspector. Not even death can silence it. Purbright inclined his head with a polite neutrality that encouraged further elaboration, but committed him to nothing. The 3 listeners turned to him with a sort of eager reverence, as though he might confirm the supernatural merely through posture. "She always did prefer the Glen," added Mr. Pendlewick, who considered himself the custodian of all local knowledge, especially the parts he had invented. "Used to practice there daily, pure devotion to her craft. If she's singing again, well, it's a sign." "Of what?" asked one of the onlookers. "That depends," Pendlewick replied solemnly. "On who's listening," Purbright offered a mild smile and excused himself, though he suspected they would continue discussing the incident with the same vigor whether he stayed or vanished entirely. Across the street, 2 school children were reenacting the event with a great deal of arm flapping, one of them attempting a high note with such reckless ambition that a passing dog barked in alarm. At the corner near Pemberton's butchery, he encountered Daphne Rigg, the clerk, from the council office. Her usual brisk efficiency had been replaced by a dreamy distraction that suggested she had slept little and speculated much. "Oh, Inspector," she breathed, clutching a stack of folders that threatened to spill from her arms. "I can't. Stop thinking about it. It was too perfect to be real. That voice, it floated, didn't it? Almost as though it was searching for something." Or someone, Purbright said gently. She blushed, for reasons he suspected were less spiritual than romantic, and nodded. Exactly. And Mrs. Barrowby Lodge says it's a message meant for the town, something unfinished, a warning, perhaps. Warnings rarely arrive in perfect pitch, Purbright replied, which Daphne took as profound insight rather than the mild joke he'd intended. At the station, Sergeant Malley greeted him with a face that carried equal measures of curiosity and wariness. A single newspaper lay on the desk, the early edition of the Flaxborough Clarion, which had wasted no time in wringing dramatic promise from the incident. Its headline declared, "Return of the Nightingale. Voice from the Glen startles council." "Sir," Malley began, tapping the paper, "I don't suppose we're treating this as anything, criminal? Only the switchboard's lit up like Advent morning?" Purbright removed his coat and considered the Clarion's front page, which featured a grainy photograph of the Glen taken in what appeared to be a hurry, complete with a blurred thumb in the corner. "Criminal is a strong word," he said. "Unusual, certainly. Intentional, almost certainly. But criminal, that remains to be seen." Malley leaned in. "Mrs. Halmeyer rang to inform us that she's expanding her heritage walking tours to include something she calls the Nightingale's Vigil. Claims she can guide visitors through Margaret Severston's spiritual footprint. £25 per person, refreshments included." Purbright allowed himself a small sigh. "Entrepreneurial spirit thrives best in the presence of imagination. That's one word for it, sir." Malley lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I wouldn't put it past some of these people to start selling commemorative teacups with her face on them, probably singing ones." The notion was depressingly plausible. Flaxborough had a remarkable capacity to convert sentiment into merchandise. By mid-morning, the trickle of claims and theories had turned into a near flood. Mr. Pell, the retired organist, delivered himself to the station uninvited, armed with a notebook filled with careful musical analysis. He insisted that the voice carried a timbre unmistakably aligned with Margaret's pre-1972 performances, which he claimed to recognize by memory and by the natural resonance imprinted upon the ear of a trained musician. Purbright listened patiently as Mr. Pell recited the precise intervals of the notes he had heard, complete with illustrations drawn on staves. Pell concluded by assuring the inspector that no living singer in Flaxborough could achieve such purity of tone, unless, he added gravely, that singer were not entirely living. Purbright thanked him with the courtesy usually reserved for people whose enthusiasm outpaced their usefulness. After escorting him out, he remained standing for a moment in the station doorway, observing the steady stream of townsfolk bustling past. Each face seemed lit with expectation, speculation, or opportunism, sometimes all three at once. The voice in the glen had become more than an incident. It was now a canvas upon which every citizen could paint their preferred interpretation. Yet, one exchange, overheard earlier outside the bakery, nudged at his thoughts. A young couple had been discussing the sudden interest in Margaret Severston memorabilia, lamenting that they should have retrieved those old records sooner before prices shot up. Someone then stood to gain from the revival of her legend. The Glen had sung, the town was responding with enthusiasm verging on frenzy. But amid the clamour of theories, Purbright sensed the faint outline of something far quieter and far more intentional. He returned inside, closing the station door behind him as the morning bustle swelled. Whatever truth lay behind the voice, it was now buried beneath a growing hill of stories, and in Flaxborough, stories were often the first tools people used to hide their motives. By early afternoon, the town's excitement had ripened into a self-sustaining fervour, and Purbright decided that listening to further embellishments would contribute nothing but fatigue. The time had come to look beyond rumour and walk the ground where the incident had actually unfolded. Sergeant Malley joined him, equipped with a notebook, a torch, and the slightly apologetic expression of a man who expected to find nothing, but felt duty-bound to search anyway. They left the station and followed the narrow footpath that wound down from the marketplace toward Fallow Glen. The day had settled into a pale, undecided sunlight that softened the edges of everything it touched. A faint breeze carried the scent of damp earth and the distant sweetness of something flowering late in the season. If not for the previous night's performance, it would have been an entirely unremarkable afternoon. "Funny thing," Malley said, as they reached the first slope of the glen, "how something can sound so close in the dark, yet look ordinary as milk pudding in daylight." Purbright nodded, though his gaze remained fixed ahead. "Darkness encourages speculation. Daylight insists on facts. Let us see which of the two was singing." They descended into the glen's cool shade. The trees formed a loose canopy overhead, their leaves whispering lightly in the shifting breeze. A small stream trickled alongside the path, making its way toward the ornamental lake with the slow determination of water seeking its proper place. The glen, for all its calm, held that faint sense of a place aware of visitors. Purbright paused, allowing his eyes to adjust to the subtle changes in light between the open footpath and the denser foliage. Last night's sound seemed to come from somewhere ahead, perhaps just beyond the clearing. Malley, ever dutiful, swept his torch beam across the ground, despite the daylight. "Reckon we'll find anything? Footprints, maybe?" "In Flaxborough," Purbright said mildly. "Footprints usually belong to dogs courting teenagers or people who deny being either." Malley grinned but resumed scanning the undergrowth. They moved deeper until the glen opened into a modest clearing bordered by tangled bramble and a leaning oak that had long served as an unofficial gathering point for picnickers. Purbright studied the space with care. The acoustics were gentle. Nothing in the clearing naturally amplified sound, which meant the clarity of the voice must have been engineered. He stepped toward a cluster of bushes. Something caught the corner of his vision, not bright but incongruous. A slim black rectangle half hidden beneath a layer of leaves. He crouched and drew it out, brushing dirt from its surface. "A portable speaker," he observed. Malley bent closer. "Cheap one, too. Looks like the kind you'd get from that discount shop on Mill Road. Battery compartment's open." He turned it over. "Still has some charge." Purbright examined the object with thoughtful calm. Placed, deliberately not lost, and if this is one, there may be more. They spent several minutes searching the immediate area. Their patience was rewarded when Malley uncovered another speaker lodged behind a moss-coated log and a third perched on a slight rise of earth, positioned as though someone had aimed sound toward the council building above. "All set to play."
"At once?" Malley asked. "Or in sequence?" Purbright replied. "The arrangement suggests an attempt at surround resonance, intended to seem natural, but not done by someone with much experience." Malley straightened, frowning. "Bit of trouble to go to for a prank, indeed."
Purbright held the first speaker again, noticing faint scratches on its side. Scratches that looked more like hasty adjustments than incidental damage. Someone had moved quickly, perhaps nervously. They continued searching but found no footprints, clear enough to track. The ground was too dry in some places, too trampled in others. Still, something about the clearing felt unsettled, as though the landscape itself remembered the intrusion. On the far side of the clearing stood a narrow footpath leading toward the Severston cottage, now owned by Margaret's last living relative, a quiet man named Leonard Havelock. Purbright considered the path for a long moment, weighing not whether to follow it, but whether to do so now. He turned slightly. "We'll pay Mr. Havelock a visit." Mally nodded, relieved to have a straightforward task. They followed the winding trail until the trees thinned and the cottage appeared, a modest stone structure with a neglected garden, its roses reaching out like supplicants for better care. A curtain twitched slightly as they approached, though the door opened only when Purbright knocked with his customary politeness. Leonard Havelock, a thin man with a nervous stoop, greeted them with an expression that hovered uncomfortably between hospitality and dread. "Inspector? Sergeant? I suppose this is about the, situation last night?" Purbright stepped inside, noting the faint scent of lavender polish and the meticulous order of the sitting room. "We are merely making routine inquiries. You are, after all, Miss Severston's only surviving relative. I imagined the incident might have been rather affecting." Havelock's hands fluttered uselessly before folding together.
Affecting? Yes, well, I prefer not to recall too much about those days. Margaret was complicated. Purbright waited. Havelock did not elaborate. "Did you hear anything from the Glen last night?" Purbright asked gently. "No," Havelock replied quickly. Too quickly. His gaze darted toward a cabinet near the mantel. Purbright followed the movement with mild interest. Nothing obvious stood out, just framed photographs and a vase of dried flowers. Yet something in Havelock's reaction felt
Rehearsed, as though he had prepared himself for a very different line of questioning. "We appreciate your time," Purbright said, rising. "Should anything come to mind, however insignificant, do let us know." Havelock nodded with visible relief, escorting them to the door. Outside, Mally lowered his voice. "He's scared of something, or guilty of something," Purbright murmured, "though perhaps not of what we're investigating." They began the walk back through the glen, the clearing now behind them. The speakers had offered their first tangible clue, but it was Havelock's brief, unguarded flicker of fear and that nervous glance toward a particular cabinet that followed Purbright back through the rustling trees like an unfinished note. By the time Purbright and Mally returned to the station, the glen's quiet shadows replaced by the town's restless bustle, a new layer of speculation had already settled across Flaxborough like energetic dust. The Clarion had issued a lunchtime update, small but bold, claiming that police were actively pursuing a line of inquiry. Precisely which line it did not say, though the accompanying photograph of a bewildered spaniel implied the reporter had run out of material before running out of enthusiasm. Inside the station, Councillor Broxby waited with the proud impatience of a man who believed he had done half the inspector's work for him. He rose the instant they entered, smoothing his jacket and clearing his throat in the manner of someone prepared to impart wisdom that would almost certainly be unwelcome. "Inspector, Purbright, I trust you'll permit me a few moments." He gestured toward the empty chair beside his own, though he did not appear eager for Purbright to sit so much as eager to feel obeyed. Purbright obliged with gentle courtesy. Mally discreetly retreated to the far desk, where he pretended to be fascinated by a drawer full of unsharpened pencils. Broxby folded his hands with theatrical gravity. "I believe I can identify the culprit behind last night's charade." Purbright lifted an eyebrow with polite interest. "Culprit? An interesting choice of word." Well, of course, the whole affair was a ruse, some ridiculous attempt
at publicity, and I know precisely who would attempt such nonsense. "Do you?" Purbright asked, though his tone made clear the question was not a challenge. "Colin Sweetman?" Broxby declared triumphantly, as though unveiling a long-awaited statue of himself.
Local filmmaker, amateur naturally, though you wouldn't know it from the way he carries on. He's always talking about his documentaries, heritage, local legends, all that sentimental claptrap. Why, just last week he asked the council for permission to film in the Glen. Something about capturing the spirit of Fallow Glen on celluloid. I refused, naturally. The man's ambitions exceed both his ability and his budget, Purbright nodded slowly. And you believe he may have staged the incident last night? Who else? Broxby demanded. He's desperate for attention.
And this whole singing ghost business would be exactly the sort of thing he'd dream up. Probably has equipment for it too, what with his filming hobbies, speakers, wires, tape recorders. Heaven knows what else he wastes his money on. Purbright
considered this without comment. Sweetman was known to the police, though only in the sense that a person who frequently wrote complaint letters occasionally wandered into the fringes of official memory. His enthusiasms tended to exceed his results, producing small films of great earnestness and very modest quality. Still, Broxby's eagerness to nominate him as the architect of a supernatural spectacle was itself worth noting. The councillor's certainty felt rather too convenient, too tidy for Purbright's taste. He rose. "Thank you, councillor. Your suggestion is noted." Broxby beamed, certain he had advanced justice more efficiently than anyone since the invention of handcuffs. "I knew you'd see reason. Sweetman's always been a nuisance. This may be the opportunity to teach him a lesson." Purbright did not reply. He merely escorted Broxby to the door with unfailing politeness and waited until the councillor's self-satisfaction drifted fully out of hearing before calling Mally. "Let's pay Mr. Sweetman a visit." Sweetman's dwelling, a cluttered semi-detached near the outskirts of town, bore the unmistakable signs of creative enterprise: tangled cables visible through the parlour window, posters for various historical reenactment events thumbtacked to the door, and, most notably, a tripod leaning like a drunken lamppost against the porch rail. Sweetman answered the door with the wary expression of a man accustomed to defending himself against criticism of projects nobody had asked him to
make.
He wore a jumper several years past its intended lifespan and glasses perpetually on the verge of slipping down his nose. "Inspector? Sergeant? Good heavens! Has something happened?" Purbright gave a small, reassuring smile. "Only routine enquiries, Mr. Sweetman. Might we come in?" The filmmaker hesitated. Not, Purbright suspected, because he feared suspicion, but because the prospect of unexpected guests in his living room visibly filled him with logistical dread. He stepped aside reluctantly. The interior confirmed Purbright's expectations. Every available surface was occupied by equipment: cameras, reels, extension cords, notebooks, and a collection of sound gear that looked second-hand at best and salvaged at worst. A faint smell of warm electronics permeated the air. Sweetman attempted to tidy by scooping several items from a chair into a precarious tower on the floor. "It's a bit, work in progress." Purbright sat gently, ignoring the faint crunch beneath the chair leg. "Mr. Sweetman, you may have heard about the incident in Fallow Glen last night." Sweetman brightened immediately. "Oh, yes, I read about it this morning. Fascinating development, tremendously dramatic."
Imagine Margaret Severston returning in song. It would make a marvellous documentary theme, don't you think?
"Quite," Purbright replied mildly. "And you yourself did not happen to be near the Glen last night." Sweetman looked genuinely affronted. "Me? Good Lord, no. I was editing until nearly midnight. You can ask Mrs. Wrexham next door. She complained about the light under my curtains." Purbright did not doubt it. Sweetman's face bore none of the defensive strain of guilt. Rather, he radiated earnestness, anxiety, and an immediate desire to explain himself in far more detail than anyone requested. And you have not recently placed any kind of equipment in the glen? Speakers, for instance? Sweetman's eyes widened. Speakers? Inspector, my speakers barely work in my own sitting room. Besides, he leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially, I'd never risk leaving equipment outdoors. I lost a tripod that way during a reenactment shoot in '08. Mud everywhere. Traumatic business. Purbright allowed him to elaborate for nearly a minute, during which Sweetman described the emotional toll of cleaning grit from delicate mechanisms. None of it suggested a man capable of orchestrating a calculated deception with composure. What did strike Purbright, however, was the faint tremor that entered Sweetman's voice when the inspector mentioned the Severston family. A tiny pause, barely perceptible, before Sweetman resumed speaking, too quickly. Purbright marked the details silently. When they left, Malley muttered, "Not exactly criminal mastermind material, sir?" "No," Purbright agreed, "but fear is a revealing thing even when misplaced." He cast a final glance at the leaning tripod on the porch, its shadow stretching thin across the path like a timid gesture. Sweetman was not their culprit. Someone wanted him to be. The afternoon light had settled into a thin, slanted gold by the time Purbright and Malley returned to the station. Sweetman's cluttered earnestness still lingered in the inspector's thoughts, not because it implicated him, but because it did almost the opposite. Sweetman had the quivering transparency of a man constitutionally incapable of running even a modest deception. If anything, he had seemed afraid of the subject itself, ducking the mention of Margaret Severston with a sudden, defensive haste that did not fit neatly with guilt. Fear, yes, but not of being caught, of something else entirely. Malley, meanwhile, had resumed sharpening pencils, a task he performed with the solemnity of a surgeon preparing instruments. "Councillor Broxby's going to be disappointed Sweetman didn't break down sobbing and confess to everything," he remarked, without looking up. "I've never known Councillor Broxby to surrender a theory merely because it is incorrect," Purbright replied. He set his hat on the desk and sat with a thoughtful, almost delicate sigh. Still, Sweetman's reaction was not without interest. Malley paused mid-sharpen. "You think he knows something?" "I think he knows that he ought not to know. Something," Purbright said lightly, "which is often more revealing than certainty." He stood again. "Before this matter becomes any more embellished, I'd like to look in on the council archives. If the town is determined to revisit Miss Severston's memory, we should see precisely what they are remembering." The archives occupied a cramped corner room beneath the council building, maintained by a faintly mummified clerk named Mrs. Ormsley. She greeted Purbright and Malley with the sort of chilly politeness reserved for people who might use the wrong drawer. Her grey bun appeared to have been lacquered into permanent solidity. Her eyebrows, equally firm, rose only at the inspector's request. "Programs from the 1970s musical recitals?" she repeated. "You realize that era isn't properly indexed, Inspector. The volunteer in charge of those years labelled everything under assorted." Purbright nodded as though this were a personal tragedy he sympathized deeply with. "Anything relating to Margaret Severston will suffice." Mrs. Ormsley disappeared among the shelves with a purposeful rustle. After a moment, a pair of narrow cardboard boxes were deposited on the table, followed by her sharp instruction, "Do not rearrange the contents." Purbright promised compliance with the sincerity of a saint and began sorting through fragile concert programs, faded tickets, handwritten notes, and a surprising number of flyers advertising amateur productions of HMS Pinafore. Malley handled each item with the exaggerated caution of someone afraid they might spontaneously disintegrate. It was Purbright who found it, folded neatly inside the program for Margaret's final recital, the one performed only weeks before her unexpected
Death.
A small page had been inserted, its edges cleaner than the surrounding material. The ink looked fresh. Too fresh. Odd, Mally murmured, peering over his shoulder. That looks new. Purbright unfolded it. The note was written in a looping, slightly florid hand. Her unfinished song shall return to the place it was first given, Fallow Glen. There, the voice shall rise again. Mally blinked. Well, that's dramatic. Purbright held the paper to the light. Even without expertise in forgeries, the conclusion was obvious. This was not written in the 1970s. The fibers are too bright, and the ink has barely settled. Someone added this recently. Why? Mally asked. Doesn't seem like the sort of thing someone would take the trouble to fake. Who'd even see it down here? Someone who expected it to be found, Purbright said softly. Or someone who wished to create a context for last night's performance. A tidy little story. The ghost returns to complete an unfinished promise. Mally scratched his head. Feels contrived. Contrived, Purbright agreed, but perhaps deliberately so. When the town encounters something implausible, it seeks a narrative. Those who provide one quickly tend to gain influence. Mally frowned. So someone staged the singing, planted this note, and hoped the two would be connected. But why hide it in the archives? Because a discovery made by accident, Purbright said, is always believed more readily than anything.
Presented openly.
He placed the note beside the program and studied the handwriting more closely. It was decorative, perhaps natural, perhaps theatrical. A hand that wanted to be admired. Sweetman's handwriting is nothing like this, Mally observed. No, Purbright said. His letters wobble like a man crossing a rope bridge in high winds. This, he tapped the note, was written by someone with confidence, even flair. Mrs. Ormsley returned, sniffing the air as though detecting mischief. Have you found what you need, Inspector? For the moment, Purbright said, sliding the items back into their folder with meticulous care. If the council is involved in a matter of municipal fraud, I should be informed, she declared stiffly. This is nothing of the sort, Purbright assured her. Merely an historical curiosity. She accepted this with the skeptical dignity of someone unconvinced, but willing to postpone inquiry until she had reported it to 3 friends and a cousin. Back on the street, Mally tucked his notebook into his pocket. So what now? That note pretty much proves this whole thing was planned.
Not by Sweetman, not by Havelock, and not by anyone with shaky hands. Purbright walked slowly, letting the afternoon air settle around him. A person who wishes to influence public sentiment must appeal to the emotions of their audience.
Reviving the memory of a beloved singer accomplishes that neatly. Someone trying to sell something? Mally guessed. Tours, memorabilia. Mrs. Halmeyer's been at it already. Possibly, Purbright murmured. Or something far more personal. People seldom forge sentiment without a motive beneath it. As they crossed the square, a gust lifted the edges of the Clarion's lunchtime edition, flipping it open. Purbright paused. The headline repeated its question, Return of the Nightingale. He glanced back toward Fallow Glen, now lying quiet under the lengthening light. The town was enthralled. Someone had wanted it to be. But the forged note, such a small, seemingly trivial flourish, had betrayed something its creator had not intended, a desire not only to revive Margaret's voice, but to shape the story of her return. A sentimental detail, yes. And yet, among all sentimentalities, such details were the most revealing of their authors. The following morning brought with it a curious blend of restlessness and expectancy, as though the whole of Flaxborough were leaning forward. Collectively, waiting for some new development to justify its deep investment in the Nightingale's return. The shops opened with unusual punctuality, conversations began before greetings, and several residents took circuitous routes to their destinations so they might pass near the council building or the glen, just in case the voice chose to repeat its performance. Purbright arrived at the station to find Sergeant Malley already entrenched behind a growing fortress of reports. "We've had 3 calls about suspicious noises," he announced. "One turned out to be a faulty extractor fan, another was a parrot, and the third was Mrs. Pickerill insisting her breadmaker was mimicking Margaret Severston intentionally." Purbright removed his coat with a mild sigh. A breadmaker rarely
harbours malevolent intent. Not in my experience, sir, though I wouldn't swear to it. Purbright took a seat.
"If Flaxborough continues at this pace, we shall be investigating the spiritual inclinations of household appliances by week's end." Malley grinned, but the levity faded as both men turned again to the question that hung invisibly between them. Who was orchestrating the town's new obsession? The forged program note had already reshaped Purbright's view of the matter. While the speakers in the glen suggested an attempt at spectacle, the planted note suggested sentiment, or manipulation of sentiment. The distinction mattered. "Let's start broadening the field," Purbright said quietly. "Someone stands to gain from the town's fascination. Perhaps not money alone. Attention can be a valuable currency." Their first stop was the tiny shop owned by Mrs. Halmere, a woman who possessed the peculiar charm of someone both business-minded and theatrically inclined. Her heritage and history tours had expanded overnight, now advertised in bright chalk on a board that leaned somewhat aggressively into the pavement. The Nightingale's footsteps, limited places. Book now. Inside, Mrs. Halmere moved, with efficient bustle, arranging glossy pamphlets on a counter that had been cleared of its usual postcards and tea towels to make room for Nightingale memorabilia, artificially aged sheet music, a few framed photographs of poor resolution, and a commemorative mug featuring a vaguely soprano-like silhouette. "My dear Inspector," she exclaimed, clasping her hands. "I knew you'd come. Isn't it thrilling? A real brush with the supernatural." Purbright regarded her with mild politeness. Most brushes with the supernatural prove to be someone's overactive enthusiasm. Her eyes sparkled. "But enthusiasm is the heart of community spirit, Inspector, and I must say business has been extraordinary. People love a bit of romance and tragedy." "Quite. And you've no idea who might have wished to stimulate such interest?" "None at all," she replied smoothly, "though I wouldn't be surprised if Margaret herself were trying to tell us something." Purbright left with the quiet impression that Mrs. Halmere's interest lay less in mystery and more in revenue, though she seemed more opportunist than architect. She lacked the restraint needed for subtlety. Any scheme of hers would have included printed tickets and discount vouchers. From there, he and Malley made their way toward the narrow footpath leading to the edge of the woods, where Arthur Venn resided in a crooked little cottage that appeared held together by habit and ivy rather than structural integrity. Venn, a solitary figure of indeterminate age and temper, was known locally for recording bird calls at hours considered unreasonable to most of the population. He opened the door with a suspicious squint. "If you've come about that song business, I've nothing to say. Not a bird, if that's what people are whispering. Birds don't sing like that." "We weren't suggesting they did," Purbright said, hands in pockets. "But you are familiar with the glen at night. Did you hear anything unusual?" Venn sniffed. "I heard people tramping where they shouldn't be, breaking branches, not careful. Amateurs. Did you see them?" "No, I was sorting recordings, but I heard movement. Heavy movement." "More than one person?" "Sounded like it." clumsy sort, not someone who understands woods. It was something, a possible indication that the staging in the glen had required more than a single pair of hands. Purbright thanked him, though Venn accepted the gratitude with the stiff reluctance of a man protecting his solitude. Their final visit of the day led them to the rehearsal rooms above the old library, where Nairi Dallop, Flaxborough's most persistent but least celebrated voice student, held her daily practice sessions. The faint, flat swell of scales drifted down the stairs before Mally winced and murmured, "Brave soul, whoever teaches her." Nairi opened the door with a dramatic flair entirely disproportionate to her surroundings. "Inspector, I imagine you're here about the voice. Yes, I heard it. No, it wasn't me. Though," she lifted her chin, "I do have a similar range." Purbright doubted this. "Did the incident affect you?" "Oh, certainly." Margaret Severston casts a long shadow over local singers. "It's hard enough getting anyone to listen to me without a ghost stealing the spotlight." She folded her arms. "But whoever did it? Well, it's tasteless, cowardly even. If someone wants attention, they should earn it." Purbright watched her a moment longer. Beneath the theatrical indignation lay something sharp, resentment perhaps. Envy had its own peculiar motives. When they finally stepped back onto the street, Mally exhaled loudly. "We've got a shopkeeper looking to profit, a recluse annoyed by trespassers, and a singer who sounds like she'd like to strangle her competition, alive or dead." "People rarely do anything without a reason," Purbright murmured. "But reasons are not always motives." "What's the difference?" "Motive is what pushes a person forward," Purbright said quietly. "Reason is what they tell themselves afterward." The late afternoon light slanted across the rooftops as they returned toward the station, the town humming with its own fervor. Every conversation, every shop window, every speculative whisper seemed to weave a wider net around Margaret Severston's memory. Someone had set all this in motion, and Purbright suspected that before long they would feel compelled to act. Flaxborough's morning had begun with its usual blend of speculation and embellishment, but by early afternoon a kind of collective impatience had seeped into the air, as though the town felt entitled to a sequel. People walked more slowly past the glen, lingered oddly near the council building, and glanced skyward with theatrical expectation. Even the Clarion's second edition printed a hopeful line: "Locals await further manifestations." Purbright, however, felt quite sure that whoever had engineered the first spectacle would not immediately risk another. Deceptions tended to be bold at their beginning, cautious during their middle, and clumsy at their end. Yet, as he had observed more than once in his career, the human appetite for attention often outpaced its sense of strategy. He had just settled behind his desk to write a preliminary report when the station telephone rang with a shrill urgency that suggested either a genuine emergency or someone upset about refuse collection. Sergeant Mally answered, listened, and stiffened. "Sir, you'll want to hear this." He held out the receiver. Purbright accepted it with calm inevitability. "Inspector Purbright." The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Clitheroe,
a woman rendered permanently breathless by life despite rarely moving at speed. "Inspector, it's happened again. The singing, but not in the glen. Oh no, it's coming from the church tower, from St. Dismas, clear as a bell, and twice as loud."
Purbright thanked her, replaced the receiver, and stood. "It seems," he said mildly, "that our composer has elected to change venues." Mally grabbed his coat. "The church tower? That's bold." "Bold," Purbright agreed, "and unnecessarily theatrical, which makes it interesting." As they approached St. Dismas, the narrow street leading to the square was already thronged with onlookers. A few had climbed onto crates or bicycles for a better view. Others simply stared upward, mouths agape, as the unmistakable voice, Margaret's voice, poured down from the bell tower with eerie clarity. The notes were long, confident, and oddly reverent in their echo. But unlike the first incident, there was something mechanical beneath the beauty. The phrasing lacked breath, the transitions were too seamless. Even without the abrupt cut-off of the previous night, Purbright recognized the unmistakable texture of recorded sound. At the tower's base, Reverend Tolliver flapped about with the helpless indignation of a man whose church had been commandeered for unauthorized performances.
"Inspector, this is intolerable. People are trampling the begonias. The bell ropes have been pulled without permission." Purbright gestured gently. "May we pass, Reverend?" "By all means," Tolliver sputtered. "But do put a stop to—"
This. We are halfway through choir rehearsals for Sunday. The wooden door to the tower stood slightly ajar. Purbright entered first, Mally close behind. The narrow staircase spiraled upward into dimness, interrupted intermittently by the swell of the disembodied soprano. Dust stirred with each footfall. Halfway up, Purbright paused, listening. The sound was not emanating from the bell chamber directly. Its positioning was higher, almost at roof level, carefully placed for maximum projection. They climbed the final steps. The bell chamber was empty, but a faint amber glow seeped from a smaller hatch leading to the upper platform. Purbright raised a hand to halt Mally and approached with slow, measured steps. Inside, the culprit revealed itself, a sturdy, reel-to-reel player, its spools turning with steady insistence. 2 portable speakers, larger than those found in the Glen, had been wired together and positioned behind the louved vents to carry the sound outward. The entire setup sat atop a canvas bag, its contents pressed beneath the weight. Mally exhaled. "This is elaborate." "Elaborate," Purbright said, "and borrowed." He leaned closer. The reel-to-reel bore a metallic plaque engraved with a faint serial number, and the top plate had a distinctive scratch, an elongated crescent mark. He remembered from the small museum that occupied rooms above the old fire station. They had displayed a collection of vintage audio equipment, much of it temperamental and seldom used. Mally followed his gaze. "That's museum property, isn't it?" "Or was," Purbright said. "It was reported missing 2 months ago, assumed misfiled. It appears it has enjoyed a second career." He switched off the machine. The voice stopped at once, replaced by a soft hum that faded reluctantly. Below them, the crowd reacted with a collective gasp, then a confused murmur. Footsteps shuffled. Someone began to clap, uncertain whether the performance was over. Purbright lifted the canvas bag. It was heavier than expected. Inside lay a tangle of wires, a second reel, a packet of batteries, and a bottle of water. Its cap twisted off, but still half full. Whoever had installed the equipment had worked recently and intended to return. Mally knelt beside the hatch, examining the latch. Not broken, they had a key. "Or access," Purbright murmured. They descended to find Reverend Tolliver anxiously guarding the door from eager parishioners and amateur ghost hunters. Purbright stepped forward with an apologetic nod. "Reverend, your tower has been used. Without permission. You may wish to change the lock." Tolliver looked scandalized. "Used? For what purpose?" "A musical exhibition," Purbright replied dryly. "Not entirely authorized." They left him, spluttering. Outside, the crowd dispersed reluctantly, propelled by disappointment and a sense that the performance had ended too abruptly to be satisfying. A few young men lingered, debating whether the ghost might take requests. Mally looked toward the tower. Someone had to carry all that equipment in there, in daylight, and without being seen. Not necessarily daylight, Purbright said. The church is often unlocked for parish use. The right moment and a little confidence can pass unnoticed. They walked back toward the station, through streets now buzzing with renewed excitement. "But, sir," Mally said slowly, "this feels different from the Glen, more polished, more public?" "Yes," Purbright replied. "Whoever staged the first incident wanted curiosity. This one seeks spectacle. So they're escalating." "Perhaps," Purbright said. "Or perhaps they are compensating." Mally frowned. "For what?" "For losing control." Purbright slowed his pace. "The first incident drew attention. The second cements a story, but the effort, the equipment, the shift to a public landmark, these are the actions of someone under pressure, someone whose plan requires the town to believe a particular narrative, and quickly. Before we find out the truth? Before someone else does," Purbright murmured. The crowd's excitement faded behind them, replaced by the quiet certainty that this new development would dislodge the fragile balance of motives he had begun to assemble. Someone had raised the stakes, and Purbright suspected the next move would be far less controlled. By the time Purbright finished the paperwork surrounding the St. Dismas's incident, dusk had folded itself neatly over Flaxborough. The tone of the town had shifted yet again. What had begun as excitement had ripened into a kind of fevered anticipation. Even through the station windows he could hear the chatter drifting from shop fronts and street corners, each retelling of the tower event, becoming slightly more dramatic as the day progressed. Someone claimed the bells themselves had chimed without human touch. Another insisted she'd seen a radiance in the tower windows moments before the singing began. Tales like yeast rose eagerly when warmed by attention. Purbright sat, aside his pen, rubbing the bridge of his nose with the slow, thoughtful gesture of a man not tired exactly, but weighing more ideas than his hands could comfortably hold. The familiar clutter of his office, soothing in its mundanity, offered little distraction. The Glen speakers, the forged program note, the stolen reel-to-reel, now resurrected atop a church tower. Each detail felt deliberate, but not all, in the same direction. He stood and crossed to the window. Below him, the lamplight scattered itself across the pavement in small pools. A pair of teenagers hurried past, laughing breathlessly, no doubt dissecting the ghost's second performance, with certainty that surpassed accuracy. Across the way, Mrs. Pickerill was lecturing her neighbour with the stern authority of one who had never been wrong in her own memory. Purbright watched them for a moment. People, he reflected, were wonderfully predictable in their unpredictability. They believed what comforted them, embellished what entertained them, ignored what troubled them, unless the trouble promised drama, which meant someone had chosen their stage with care. He returned to his chair, opening his notebook. Not for evidence. They had very little of that, but for observations, which often proved far more useful. He wrote a single word: pressure. The escalation troubled him. The first event had been cautious, even clumsy. Amateur equipment hidden in undergrowth. A performance designed to startle a few and be carried by rumour. The second incident, however, was grandiose, loud, public, far riskier. Whoever orchestrated it had discarded subtlety entirely, and people did not abandon subtlety unless forced. He tapped the notebook thoughtfully. If the first incident was meant to create a stir, why the need for a second? Why the urgency? Why move from a quiet glen to the most visible structure in town? Mally's earlier question resurfaced. Before someone else does? Yes. Someone might very well be trying to keep ahead of a truth that threatened to surface. The staging itself may not be the crime, but a distraction. Spectacle to draw eyes away from something quieter, something inconvenient. He leaned back, letting the silence fill the room. Margaret Severston's memory was at the center of all this. Not her life, perhaps, but the romanticized version of it the town preferred. Her talent, her untimely death, her lingering mystique. People projected their own imaginings onto her, which made her an excellent instrument for misdirection. A ghost, especially a beloved one, could be very useful. His mind drifted briefly to Leonard Havelock, the anxious relative whose eyes had flicked so nervously toward that cabinet. Havelock had been too eager to dismiss Margaret's memory, too quick to avoid questions, too careful in hiding something he had not been asked about. Was his fear connected to the staged hauntings, or merely a private discomfort dredged up by the town's sudden nostalgia? Then Sweetman, earnest, bumbling, frightened of the very idea of being implicated, yet unmistakably troubled when Margaret's name arose. His nervousness had not been guilt. Purbright was sure of that. But recognition. Of what? Mrs. Halmeyer, opportunist but not subtle. Arthur Venn, territorial and irritated but hardly theatrical. Nairi Dallop, jealous, ambitious, perhaps wounded. By comparisons she could never hope to overcome. Motives were not in short supply, but connection, true connection, to the mechanics of the incidents was. Purbright closed the notebook. A good mystery rarely relied on the obvious suspects. In Flaxborough, as in most of life, the truth often perched quietly behind the noisiest explanations, waiting to be noticed by someone patient enough to look past the commotion. His stomach reminded him with mild insistence that he had neglected supper. He locked the station and stepped into the cool evening. The air carried the faint scent of damp stone and distant chimney smoke. The square, though calmer than earlier, still hosted pockets of animated speculation. A group gathered near the pub door, arguing about whether ghosts aged or remained the same forever. Another cluster stood beneath the lamp-post nearest the church, gesturing upward to argue about acoustics. Purbright moved through them unobtrusively, offering nods that were returned with reverence, usually reserved for magistrates or meteorologists. He slipped down a quieter lane where the chatter faded into murmurs. The church tower rose above the rooftops, now silent and still. Through its darkened louvres, one could easily imagine the machine sitting alone, its spools frozen mid-story, a poor stand-in for a woman whose real voice had once filled rooms with warmth and promise. He paused at the base of the tower, listening. No rustle of movement above. No cautious footsteps. No returning saboteur. Whoever had climbed up with their burden earlier had not come to retrieve it under cover of night. Unfinished business, then. He resumed walking, following the slope that led toward his home. The cobbles glistened faintly with dew, lamps made soft, halos in the mist beginning to gather at ground level. It was, he thought, a fitting night for the dead to sing. Not that the dead ever truly did. It was always the living who put words or music into their mouths. Near his doorstep, he paused once more, glancing back over the quiet town. The glen and the tower stood on opposite sides of Flaxborough, yet both now hummed invisibly with the residue of human intention. Whoever had begun this performance was improvising now. That made them vulnerable. And Purbright, patient as ever, was willing to let them play their next note, knowing it might finally reveal the hand behind the conductor's baton. The next morning arrived with the heavy, anticipatory quiet that often precedes a storm, not a meteorological one, but the sort stirred by human excitement left too long without a new development. The townsfolk, starved of fresh spectacle since the dramatic interruption at St. Dismas's, had turned wholeheartedly to speculation. The Clarion's headline, "Nightingale silent for now," read like an accusation aimed at the apparition for neglecting its public. Purbright, stepping into his office, felt the shift immediately. Flaxborough's collective mood now carried an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. People were beginning to expect patterns, meanings, messages. When a story takes on its own momentum, those hoping to exploit it often act rashly. A useful moment, then, to prod the actors involved. He had arranged, with deliberate nonchalance, to meet 3 individuals that morning in a neutral setting: Mrs. Halmire, Nairi Dallop, and Leonard Havelock. The choice of venue was important. Too formal, and they would rehearse their answers. Too casual, and they might not guard their reactions enough for his purposes. He selected the tea room on Mallow Street, a place with lace curtains, quiet tables, and a proprietor who understood the value of discreet observation. Purbright arrived early, choosing a table in the corner where he could see the door, and, more importantly, the expressions people wore when they walked through it. Mrs. Halmire arrived first, smelling faintly of lavender polish and entrepreneurial optimism. She took her seat with a bustle that suggested she expected to be congratulated for her time. Nairi followed moments later, wrapped in a coat slightly too theatrical for the weather. Her chin lifted defensively at the sight of Mrs. Halmire, as though expecting to be accused of vocal envy again. Havelock arrived last. His entrance carried the twitchy hesitance of a man who feared every conversation might become a confession. His eyes darted from Mrs. Halmire to Nairi to Purbright with the nervous alertness of someone scanning for danger. Purbright greeted them pleasantly, gesturing for tea to be served, as though this were merely a sociable engagement. The 3 sat, uneasily, their expressions revealing varying degrees of curiosity, apprehension, and irritation. "I appreciate you all taking a moment this morning," Purbright said, his tone light, almost apologetic. "I thought it might be helpful to clarify a few small matters." Nairi muttered something about hoping this wouldn't take long, while Mrs. Halmire arranged her scarf to appear important. Havelock simply swallowed and nodded. Purbright's manner remained warm, conversational, designed to lull, not intimidate. His questions, when they came, would not be accusations but gentle pebbles dropped into calm water to observe the ripples. He began harmlessly. "You each, in your own way, have some connection to Margaret Severston's memory. I wondered what you thought of these recent performances." Mrs. Halmire seized the opportunity first. "Well, Inspector, the supernatural chooses curious times, and I've always said Margaret's presence still lingers. The town feels it." Nairi rolled her eyes. "Presence? Please, it's someone with too much time and poor artistic taste." She looked directly at Purbright. "Whoever's doing this is desperate for attention, that's all," Havelock said. "Nothing at first, only wringing his fingers beneath the tablecloth." "And you, Mr. Havelock?" Purbright asked kindly. He started. I don't know what to think. It's all very upsetting, dredging things up. Margaret deserves to rest." His voice quavered slightly. "People interfering with her memory. It's indecent." "Interesting," Purbright thought. "Firm emotion, but imprecise wording. Not her voice, not her recordings, not her things, her memory. An abstract discomfort, not a specific injury. Or perhaps a specific one concealed beneath abstraction." He took a gentle sip.
"Of tea, indeed," he said. "Speaking of memory, I came across something yesterday that struck me as rather curious."
3 pairs of eyes sharpened, Mrs. Halmire's with calculated interest, Nairi's with suspicion, Havelock's with alarm. Purbright smiled pleasantly, as though discussing the weather. In the council archives, a program note was discovered.
A new one, something written recently but placed among old materials, a sentimental reference to Margaret's unfinished song returning to the glen. Quite touching. Nairi stiffened. Mrs. Halmire leaned forward.
Havelock's breath caught in a tiny, unmistakable hitch. Purbright continued, seemingly oblivious to the reactions blooming around him. I was struck by the handwriting, flourished, expressive, carefully composed. Someone took great care with.
Someone who wanted the note to be found at the right moment. Nairi looked offended. I don't write like that, she snapped. Too fussy. Mrs. Halmire nodded primly. Handwriting analysis is very important in historical research.
I once hosted a seminar. Purbright wasn't watching them. His gaze rested lightly, politely, on Leonard Havelock. Havelock had frozen completely. His hands, mid-clasp, had stiffened like figures carved from wax. His eyes had gone wide, not merely surprised but wounded, as though a private thought had been laid bare without warning. Colour drained slowly from his face. Purbright let the silence hang, deceptively gentle. Then he asked the question, the smallest, softest question, delivered with the benign innocence of a man making conversation at a garden party. Mr. Havelock, tell me, did Margaret ever write in that particular style, or was that flourish something newer within the family? The effect was instant. Havelock
inhaled sharply, mouth opening before he could prevent it, a reflex of defense that arrived too early, too quickly.
He closed it almost at once, but the damage was done. A flicker of panic lit his expression. A tremor travelled through the hand nearest the teacup, enough to set the spoon rattling faintly. I don't know, he managed. I hardly remember. Her handwriting. It was so long ago. Purbright nodded kindly. Of course, grief blurs many small details. Mrs. Halmire chimed in with some comment about fountain pens and archival ink, but Purbright heard none of it. He heard only the tremor in Havelock's voice, the way his gaze had fled to the window, avoiding both Purbright and the teacup as though they accused him. A question had touched him, lightly, politely, and he had flinched. When the meeting ended, the others left briskly, eager to return to their respective roles in the town's growing spectacle. But Havelock lingered, unintentionally, hesitating near the doorway, as though unsure whether to speak, flee, or dissolve. Mr. Havelock, Purbright said softly, retrieving his hat. Havelock froze again. Do take care, Purbright murmured. These matters weigh heavily on some more than others. Havelock swallowed, nodded shakily, and left without another word. Purbright stepped onto the street a moment later, the morning sun slanting across the cobbles. A gentle breeze carried faint voices from the town square, more talk of ghosts, melodies, mysteries. But the true note of interest had already been struck, and it had come from the tremor in Leonard Havelock's hands. Evening drew itself over, Flaxborough with a heavy stillness, as though the very air sensed something nearing its conclusion. The town, however, remained in a state of restless suspense. Conversations grew quieter now, less boastful, tinged with the unease that arises when excitement lasts too long without direction. A few residents even confessed, softly, guiltily, that perhaps the ghost business had gone far enough. Purbright, walking the narrow crescent leading toward the council offices, sensed this shift with a kind of quiet satisfaction. When public appetite wanes, truth is easier to coax into daylight, and tonight he intended to draw not merely truth, but its architect into the open. He had requested, politely, officially, but without ceremony, that Councillor Broxby, Mrs. Halmire, Nairi Dallop, Leonard Havelock and Sergeant Malley meet him in the council's small side chamber. A simple gathering, he had said, a clarification of matters, nothing more. The kind of invitation no respectable citizen would refuse, especially when delivered in Purbright's unhurried voice. He arrived last by design, stepping into the room with the calm of a man who had spent the afternoon watching a complicated puzzle align itself. They were all there, Broxby tapping his foot impatiently, Nairi glowering at a portrait of a past mayor, Mrs. Halmire rearranging the sugar bowl, Malley standing quietly near the back, and Havelock sitting apart, pale and small, as though trying to disappear between the chair and its shadow. Purbright closed the door gently behind him. "Thank you for coming. I shall try not to keep you long." The room settled. "As you know," he began, "Flaxborough has been treated to what many believe are the ghostly echoes of Margaret Severston. A charming notion, almost convincing." Mrs. Halmire nodded enthusiastically. Nairi snorted. Broxby rolled his eyes in theatrical impatience. Purbright continued, his tone soft but deliberate. "Yet the events in the Glen and Tower were not the work of ghosts, nor accidents. They were staged, using portable speakers, pre-recorded reels."
"And the stolen museum equipment," Broxby cleared his throat loudly. "Inspector, we know this already. The question is who—" "Yes," Purbright agreed mildly. "And why?"
"Because the motive for theatrics often reveals more than the performance." He stepped closer to the long oak table. "The first incident in the Glen was modest. The second in the Tower was public. Escalation under pressure. Someone wanted the town captivated, and quickly, someone who feared losing control of a narrative they were trying very hard to shape." Havelock shifted. Nairi's eyes flicked toward him briefly. Purbright drew a folded page from his pocket and placed it on the table. The forged concert program note. "This," he said, "was planted in the archives. Written with a hand both fond and practiced. A sentiment meant to appear nostalgic, even romantic. But its placement was not nostalgic. It was strategic." Nairi leaned forward. "Strategic in what way?" "To create a legend," Purbright replied. "A justification for the Glen performance. Something that would make Flaxborough receptive, willing, even eager, to believe Margaret's voice had a reason to return." Mrs. Halmire blinked rapidly. "Well, it worked, didn't it? Everyone was enchanted." "Yes," Purbright said, "almost everyone." His gaze rested gently, almost kindly, on Havelock. Havelock's throat tightened in a visible swallow. Broxby frowned. "You're not suggesting—" "Mr. Havelock," Purbright said softly, "was in the archive room last month. Mrs. Ormsley confirmed it. He said he was looking for family papers, yet he took nothing, at least nothing recorded." Havelock twitched, but said nothing. "You also told me," Purbright continued, "that recalling Margaret was upsetting, something you preferred not to revisit. Yet you kept glancing at a particular cabinet in your sitting room, a cabinet that, when inspected this afternoon—" Havelock jolted upright. "You went into my house?" "Sergeant Malley did, with your neighbour's permission to observe the property from her adjoining window." Purbright's tone remained impeccable. "We saw enough." Malley stepped forward, placing a small cloth bundle on the table. Purbright opened it with care. Inside lay a vintage photograph of Margaret Severston, her signature in the lower corner, slightly faded but unmistakable. The handwriting matched the flourish on the forged program note. Havelock stared, colour
flooding and draining from his face in alternating waves. "Purbright raised the photograph," you wrote the note.
"You created the legend of the unfinished song. You triggered the first spectacle, but you did not perform the Tower incident yourself. Someone helped you." Nairi stiffened. Mrs. Halmire stopped breathing altogether. Broxby's jaw worked. In slow bewilderment, Purbright continued, his voice so gentle it might have been mistaken for sympathy. You adored Margaret, not as the town adored her, but personally, quietly, deeply. And when she died, your grief became private, unspoken, unshared. But recently, 2 months ago, you learned something that wounded you enough to unbury her memory. Havelock whispered, I didn't mean... You discovered the museum intended to auction Margaret's personal effects, Purbright said. The reel-to-reel, the recordings, the letters. Items that should have stayed with her family. Instead of contesting it openly, you sought to make the town value Margaret again, enough to protest, enough to stop the sale. Nyrie's expression softened with unexpected pity. Mrs. Halmire looked stricken. Even Broxby seemed thrown off his usual self-importance. Havelock pressed his shaking hands against his eyes. They were going to sell her voice, her life, to strangers. So you staged her return, Purbright said quietly. You made Flaxborough fall in love with her again. You believed if her presence felt real, felt undeniable, the town would never allow her belongings to be taken. Havelock's voice cracked. I didn't want to hurt anyone. And you didn't intend the tower incident? Purbright asked gently. Havelock shook his head rapidly. No, that wasn't me. I only did the Glen. The tower... Someone else wanted to help. They thought it needed to be bigger, more dramatic. Purbright nodded slowly. Nyrie? She stiffened. I wasn't helping. I thought if people were talking about Margaret again, they might listen to me.
Too, I didn't know it mattered that much. Purbright inclined his head. Thank you.
He turned back to Havelock. In the Glen, sir, we heard an imitation of Margaret Severston, but you, more than anyone, knew the true voice. Not the ghost. Not the recording, the woman. Havelock's tears spilled freely now. I just wanted them to remember her properly. Purbright folded the cloth back around the photograph. And they will, he said softly. But not as a ghost. The room remained silent, filled with the quiet settling of truth. Painful, human, and utterly free of the supernatural glow Flaxborough had so eagerly imagined. And outside, unnoticed, the evening breeze stirred the leaves of the glen, carrying no voice at all. In the days that followed Purbright's quiet revelation, Flaxborough behaved exactly as Flaxborough always did when a matter of great excitement resolved itself into something merely human. It set about tidying up the story until it fitted comfortably into its preferred understanding of the world. This was not dishonesty so much as civic habit. The town disliked loose ends. It preferred them tied, trimmed, and tucked away where they could be admired or ignored according to taste. The Clarion printed a modest follow-up article, Tower Incident, a misunderstanding, say police, which many residents read with the serene satisfaction of people who had been right all along, even when they had been spectacularly wrong. Some insisted they had suspected a mortal explanation from the beginning. Others maintained that the ghost had indeed appeared, but had been frightened away by excessive newspaper coverage. Both positions, curiously, existed without conflict. Mrs. Halmire took down her Nightingale's Footsteps chalkboard after a brief but profitable run, replacing it with a sign advertising a harvest heritage stroll, which she described to customers as far more grounded, dear. Her Nightingale mugs, however, lingered discreetly on the back shelf, just in case sentiment resurged. Nyrie Dallop developed a sudden, vocally convenient cold that lasted long enough to avoid answering questions directly about her involvement in the Tower episode. She returned to her rehearsals with renewed determination, though she chose, for several weeks, to practice exclusively behind closed windows. Her expression in public carried a mixture of defiance and embarrassment, as though she had simultaneously received praise and scolding in equal measure. Councillor Broxby, after taking several opportunities to explain to anyone who would listen that he had always suspected Sweetman was innocent, shifted his attention back to more pressing municipal matters. Chief among these was his long-standing crusade against wheelie bins left at rebellious angles. The ghost affair, he declared, had been a distraction from real civic issues. Privately, he was relieved that the tower had not required structural repairs. He would have been forced to argue about budgets with himself. Leonard Havelock, for his part, withdrew almost entirely from view. Not in shame, Purbright never encouraged that, but in the quiet, inward-turning way of a man who had carried too much alone for too long. The museum trustees, once informed of his familial attachment to Margaret Severston's belongings, agreed with surprising graciousness to delay the proposed sale. A small committee was formed to review the cultural value of the collection, which in practice meant that nothing would happen for months. This suited Havelock extraordinarily well. There was talk, gentle, sympathetic talk, of gathering information to create a small, permanent display in the library about Margaret's life. Purbright suspected the display would be modest, tasteful, and rarely visited except by schoolchildren completing assignments, but it would exist, a place where her voice, or memory of her voice, could settle without manipulation. As for the stolen reel-to-reel, the museum requested its return in the least accusatory letter Purbright had ever read. The curator appeared almost apologetic when accepting it, murmuring something about creative uses of preserved artifacts before quickly locking it away. Life did not simply return to normal, it resumed its usual course with the faintest of adjustments, like a river that had momentarily changed direction only to glide back into familiar banks. Purbright watched these shifts with a kind of detached fondness. Flaxborough was at its most bearable when recovering from excitement. People became gentler, their certainties softer, their gossip less venomous. The town exhaled. On an afternoon of thin, clouded sunlight, he took a solitary walk through Fallow Glen. The clearing where the speakers had once been hidden looked much as it always had, untidy in places, serene in others, with a quiet that did not need performance to seem meaningful. A single bird trilled from a branch overhead, its notes honest and unembellished. Purbright paused, listening. There was no echo of Margaret's recorded voice, no carefully staged resonance, only the natural hum of leaves and distant water. The returning stillness felt like an apology from the land itself, or perhaps simply a reminder that human dramas pass while the glen remains unchanged. He continued along the footpath until he reached the small rise overlooking the town. From there, Flaxborough stretched gently before him, rooftops softened by distance, chimneys releasing thin threads of smoke, the church tower rising with quiet dignity rather than melodrama. It was difficult to imagine the place as a stage for grand deception. Flaxborough did not suit grandeur. It was built for small secrets, small scandals, small reconciliations. When he reached the station later that day, he found Sergeant Malley, filling out forms with the resigned patience of a man discussing potholes with paperwork. Malley looked up, eyes bright with the restless hope that something interesting might yet occur. "Any developments, sir?" "Only in the sense that life continues," Purbright replied, hanging his coat. "Which is development enough," Alley nodded, then hesitated. "Do you think we'll hear more about the Nightingale?" Purbright considered this, folding his hands on the desk. "I think Flaxborough will hear precisely as much as it wishes to hear," he said. "Ghosts seldom speak loudly unless prompted. and I believe our prompting days are finished." Mally grinned. "Paperwork from here on out, then?" Purbright gave a gentle, rueful smile. A reliable companion. As the afternoon waned, he settled into his familiar routine of forms, reports, and small administrative irritations that held none
of the allure of mysterious voices, but all the comfort of predictability.
The station hummed softly with the sound of its own settled rhythm. Outside, the town grew quieter still. Shop shutters lowered, lamps flickered on one by one, casting their warm halos across the cobblestones. The breeze wandered without urgency, through the streets, brushing past windows and hedges, stirring nothing more dramatic than the occasional crisp packet. The singing had stopped. The mystery had settled. The town, with its talent for smoothing the sharp edges of recent events, had begun to fold the whole business into a gentle, palatable tale, a curious episode, a sentimental misunderstanding, a reminder of a beloved voice from long ago. Flaxborough preferred its stories that way, softened, compact, and ready to be stored alongside others of equal charm. Purbright completed his last form of the day, placed it neatly atop the stack, and allowed himself a quiet, contented breath. Then he reached for his next sheet of paperwork, and with that simple, unremarkable gesture, the matter of the Nightingale of Fallow Glen was finally laid to rest. The end.